I'm going to, first of all, say you're going to need anaglyph glasses for this. That's the only format I'll be presenting 3D in. So I will do a few seconds more of useless introduction, and you can scurry around and get your hands on those if you don't already have them. I'm going to be talking about stereo baseline today. I've written about it tons and tons in the past, but a few months ago, Pascal, our next presenter, asked me to write about it yet again and take a slightly different tack. He wanted something that he could present to a group, I think, of teenagers that he's working with. He wanted something hands-on, simple, straightforward, not a lot of formulas or no formulas, not necessarily dependent on any particular piece of software like Photoshop or Stereo Photo Maker. And that's what I gave him. And it's very different than what I've done in the past. He said it worked very well, although maybe he was just telling me that to be nice. Anyway, that's what I'm going to be presenting today. And then Pascal's presentation will kind of tie into that, because I'm going to be talking about the mechanical aspects of baseline, and he'll talk a bit about the creative aspects of it, because you want to control baseline to make your stereos viewable, but you may also want to control it to do something to achieve a specific effect. Okay, so here we are. A 3D photograph consists of at least two images taken from separate viewpoints. I think we all know that. But how much separation? So today I want to give you some specific practical guidance on how to consistently take 3D photos that have the right amount of separation. And by right, I mean an amount of depth that is easy to view and has 3D impact. So what do I mean by separation or baseline? It's pretty simple. If you're talking about a stereo camera, a two-lensed camera, then it's simply the separation of the lenses. And in some cases that's fixed, and in some cases you can alter it. And is my mouse cursor visible to you or not? Did I lose everyone?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, can you see my mouse cursor?
Yes, we can.
Okay, because I may be using that to indicate things. So in this particular rig, I've got two knobs here, and those loosen the cameras, and they're in slots, so I can slide the lenses in this camera to change the spacing. But on other 3D cameras like a Fuji W3 or a W1, I have a fixed spacing. Now, if I'm doing a sequential 3D, in other words, if I'm taking a 3D with a single camera and taking a series of individual exposures in sequence, then that baseline is simply the distance that I've moved the camera between exposures, which is what I've indicated here. Okay, so what difference does it make? Well, to understand that, I'm going to show you a series of photos. They're similar to something I've showed before. In this case, I took a series of sequential photos, like I'm showing here. I started with the camera in the leftmost position, and then I moved it slightly between each exposure and took a bunch. And I'm going to show you those photos, so get your 3D glasses ready. And I don't know if everybody wants to unmute themselves, but if you want, you can even maybe indicate by whatever means that when I get to the one that you think has the right amount of depth, and right means the right one for you. I'm putting on my glasses and I'm looking at photo number 1, which to me has very little depth. And here's photo number 2, which has very slightly more depth. And are these coming through quickly? The one thing I don't know is how fast they're popping up on your screen.
Yeah.
Okay. If I'm talking about something you haven't seen yet, let me know.
Okay.
Okay, here's the third one. Starting to see some real depth. Is anybody loving this one yet?
The third one's, yeah.
That's good, yeah.
Okay, now I'm getting into the territory. Here's the fourth one where I'm starting to think it looks like a cube. It's got obvious depth, and it's pretty much got the cubic proportions. Maybe even a little bit more here, maybe too much.
It's a bit too hyper, I think.
Yeah, now I'm going farther. Anybody loving this one? even farther, and very, very much farther. And I think that may be, oh no, there's even one more. Okay, I think, can we all agree that that one's painful to look at?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, what was that?
Well, I think once you got past number 4,
Mhm.
because it's anaglyph, it also starts to ghost
Right,
more.
you get some ghosting too, right?
And I actually liked 3 better.
I think I like,
Uh-huh.
I
Yeah.
think I like 3 also.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so there's no problem with having a little bit of diversity of opinion on that, because what looks right to you depends on several factors. They include things like the size of your display, your distance from it, and your personal preference for that matter. So it doesn't really matter which one of those cube photos look the best to you. The takeaway is that too little baseline gives you almost no 3D effect, and too much makes the image hard to view or distorted looking. So the right baseline, and I'm doing little air quotes around the right, gives you an image that has a satisfying amount of 3D, isn't uncomfortable to view, and doesn't distort the object, assuming you don't want it distorted. So right means that it delivered the depth effect you intended and desired, okay? So how do you know in advance what the right baseline is going to be for a specific photograph? And the answer to that is actually very simple. It depends. And it depends on a lot of things. Some of these are related to the subject material. For example, one of these is the size of the object you're photographing, or the total amount of depth in the scene. So let me show you what I mean by that in a couple of photos. Now, each of these 2 photos, here's the first one, was taken at the same distance from the object and with the same baseline. So here's the first one, it's a little dog toy. And here's the second one, same thing, but I flipped it around to a different angle. So there's less overall, excuse me, depth in this photo, because the nearest and farthest point of the main subject is smaller than in this photo. I've arranged it here so that the nearest and farthest point are much farther apart. So hopefully you can see that even though these were taken under virtually identical conditions, one has way more depth than the other. So the point of this is that the same baseline, the same distance to the subject, can give me photos with very different amounts of depth, depending on the subject material and how I've composed it. And for this one, in fact, I probably could have used a much larger baseline or separation when I took it before I started to get the kind of uncomfortable distortion that we saw in the last few cube photos. Some of the other things that influence how we see depth in a 3D image have to do with the way you're viewing it and reproducing it. And a key one is the size of the screen or the print or the display, whatever. The way you're viewing it, are you viewing it through a magnifying viewer? Are you viewing it just with glasses that have no magnification? Are you free viewing, whatever? Another big one is your distance from the display. And it's important to realize that the larger you're going to reproduce your 3D image, in other words, the larger the display or the screen, the less overall depth it should have. So an Instagram image meant for viewing on a phone screen can and should have way more depth, way more baseline than an image that you're going to show on a movie screen. And let's try a little demo, depending on, hopefully some of you can at least do this. Here's this image again. And if it's possible for you, I want you to see if you can get up and walk farther back from your display and see how that affects the depth that you perceive in this image. And I think you'll see that when you get very far back and as you walk closer to the screen, the bone seems to shrink as you get closer to it, which is a problem a lot of us older male 3D photographers experience. But I hope you can actually see what I'm talking about here. As you move closer or farther from the screen, and even if you're just sitting there, if you move your face closer or farther away, you'll see that as you get very close, the depth almost completely disappears. And as you go farther back, it does seem to stretch a bit. And if you can get up and walk up quite a bit back, you'll really see it. So subject size, subject distance, viewing method, display things, all these affect a 3D image and play into how much baseline you should use when you make it. Now, this may seem like an awful lot to consider, especially since you might not even know some of the information about how you're going to view the thing when you're taking the image. So that may seem like calculating the baseline or even estimating it when you're taking the photo is kind of complicated. So let's talk about a few things you can do in practice to get results you want that aren't too complicated. So let's first talk about taking sequential 3Ds. Again, what I talked about here. One of the things you can do if you're taking sequential photos is simply to take several and move the camera slightly between each image, between each exposure. And that's what I showed you before here. So I took 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and so on. And then after you've taken this series of photos, you just view various combinations in 3D that have different baselines. So the narrowest pair would be combining images 1 and 2 into a stereo, and then maybe 1 and 3 and 1 and 4. And you'll get successively more baseline with each pair that you separate farther. And that's exactly what I did for that cube photo. I took a series of 10 photos, and then I showed you 1 and 2, a pair that was 1 and 3, a pair that was 1 and 4. And you saw directly how it started out with very little depth and rapidly progressed through having enough depth to having way too much depth. And that may sound kind of like a lot of work, but after you've had some experience, I think you'll get a feel for how much baseline works in a given situation. And you'll probably find yourself taking usually maybe 4 or 5 photos of a given subject to get one that works well when you start matching them up. And you also may find yourself making multiple versions of a given image. For example, I present most of my images in 2 very different places, one on Instagram and the other at my local 3D club where we project on a large screen, or we used to when we still had in-person meetings. So a lot of times I will make 2 different pairs of the same image, one with a very large separation that I use for Instagram, which gives me much more extreme depth, and one with a smaller separation that I'm using for large screen projection. And I'll tell you right now, I've been shooting 3D for 42 years, and I've done a lot of hyperstereos and done this where I take a series of photos. And I don't think I've ever taken one where I used too little depth. I always end up using the closest pair, and even that usually has too much. So maybe that's just me, but my advice, at least to myself, is start smaller than you think you need and go out from there. Now, if you're shooting with a 2-lens 3D camera like the Fuji W1 or W3, then your baseline is set, as I said. So in this case, you're going to control depth in the photo by positioning yourself and your camera relative to the subject matter. So in other words, you might get closer or farther from your subject, or choose to keep certain elements in the scene that are very close or very far out of your composition. Let me show you an example of what I mean here. Simple picture of a flower, and the background, which is directly behind it, is quite far back. And for me, it's not terribly pleasant to view. My eye shifts kind of uncomfortably between that foreground and the background. It's very far back. So how about if I had just taken a step over to the right and then flipped the camera the other way and taken it this way? Same subject, I'm about the same distance, and of course I've got the same lens spacing. I didn't adjust my camera. But now I've moved into a position where the background is much closer to the main subject, and in my opinion, this is easier to view in terms of depth. But it's interesting to notice, I think, that there are some areas where this doesn't work so well. Like if you can see my mouse cursor down here, where we've got this light and kind of visually complex bit behind the flower, I find that way more distracting than this stuff up here that's relatively dark and also maybe a little bit closer. So the lesson here is it's not just depth, It's also about being aware of your background and avoiding elements that will visually compete or distract from your main subject. So let me give you some specific numbers for those who might be shooting with a Fuji W1 or W3 or any of the vintage stereo cameras. Those all typically have a baseline that's in the 2.5 to 3 inch separation. The lens separation on all those cameras is typically in that range, unless they were specifically designed for macro. And that's done because the spacing of adult human eyes is typically in that range. So if you were taking photos for projection, these would be your guidelines. If your closest object in the photo is 2.5 feet from you, then don't have anything in the photo that's farther than 4 feet. If your closest object is 4 feet, then don't have anything farther than 7 feet. And if you have infinity, like the sky or something very, very far away, whatever, a mountain in your photo, don't place anything closer than 7 feet in your composition. So please memorize these numbers. They will be on the test. But these numbers will reliably produce images that are suitable for large screen viewing. And if you're displaying your images on a small screen like an Instagram, you can stretch them a bit. In fact, you have to stretch them quite a bit, I think, to get something that has any kind of depth impact. Now, besides just these numbers as far as what's closest and farthest, it's also important to realize that viewing comfort in a 3D photo depends not just on total depth, but the way the depth is distributed. Now, I've shown you this image before, I think, and I'm bringing it up again. There's 3 sets of circles, and in each case, the distance, the depth distance between this front one and this back one, this front one and this back one, this front one and this back one is identical. They're all the same. But for me, that top set where they're kissing is a little bit bothersome to view. The middle set where I've got a series of circles interposed in between is comfortable to view. And I think that's because all those middle circles act as kind of stepping stones that take my eye gradually from that close one to the far one. And same thing here. This back one just has blank space in between them. And I think that blank space gives my eyes time to readjust when I shift my gaze from the close one to the far one. And hopefully you guys are all seeing the same thing. Hopefully you're all seeing that there's a little bit of shimmering or something slightly bothersome in this top pair. Maybe I should have made the depth a little more extreme to make that more obvious, but I don't want to hurt anybody. Now, let me show you a real world example of this, just so you can really see what I'm talking about in practice. Okay, simple picture of a couple of potted plants. And they're arranged so that there is a nice, gentle leading line, the line of the bricks and the fence between them. Okay, I don't have any trouble viewing this thing at all, and hopefully you don't either. Now I'm going to flip those around, and I've taken this from virtually the same distance. The pots are separated by the same amount, and I'm virtually the same distance. But this one is starting to be rather uncomfortable for me to view, because this front pot is right in front of the farthest thing. And I think if I had gone with a little bit, if I'd gotten a little bit closer to the ground, which is hard for me to do at my age, and put that front pot so it really was superimposed in front of the back one, this would be even more unpleasant to view. So let me just switch those one more time so you can see. It's about the same separation, but to me, there is a major difference in viewing comfort in these two images. Here's a less contrived, more real-world photo that shows you the same thing. This has a huge amount of depth, but I don't have any trouble viewing it, and I've seen this projected, and I didn't have any trouble with it because the floor, everything leads you in from the closest things to the farthest point in it. And I had an idea. I didn't have a chance to do it beforehand, but I should do a version of this where I superimpose something, I composite in something close that hangs right in front of the far point so that you could see how disturbing it would be if I had that same situation where I had something close right in front of something that's very far. Okay, the last thing I want to show you is a useful tool for anyone who's shooting with their phones using the 3D steroid application. So just to remind you how that works, here's what the screen looks like in steroid. You take a picture and it looks something like this. And then when you go to take your second exposure, the software actually shows you your first image ghosted over the second one, so you can line things up exactly the way you want and see how much things are shifting, and also make sure that you haven't tilted or radically changed your point of view. So let me go through a series of images done this way and show you what the results are. So here's an exposure that has a relatively small shift, as you can see. So you can see here's the difference mostly between the first and second exposure. And here's that picture in 3D. Here's the actual result. Here's one with a larger separation. Here's the result of that. And here's one with a very, very much larger separation, and the result of that. So let me run back through those two things so you can see them in succession. First one, second one, third one. You can see I'm shifting progressively more, and here's the results. First one has some 3D. Second one has a medium amount of 3D. This one is quite pleasant for me to view on this screen I'm looking at. Third one, a lot more 3D. And just to let you know, I don't want to get, like I say, mired down in formulas, but just to let you know, in terms of depth, this first one has a 1/50th shift. In other words, the difference between the left and the right, the parallax in it, is 1/50th of the width of the image. This one has a 30th. That's the number that's typically considered acceptable for large screen projection. And if you go back to that chart I showed before, that would give you this amount of depth, a 1/30th deviation. This will work well on projection. This one has a 15th. Might be a little extreme for any of you looking at it, even on a monitor or anything bigger than a phone. But I put this on my phone just to see how it worked. It works fine. And in fact, this is about the separation, or maybe a slight bit less, that I use for most of my Instagram images. So it looks fine on a phone, maybe a little more extreme than what you can handle here. I don't know. So that's what I wanted to show you. I wanted to give you a sense that of how you control the overall depth in your image and how to make it, how to make an image viewable without overwhelming you with a bunch of formulas or complicated software tools or whatever. The real takeaway is that the baseline you use makes a big difference in how an image looks in terms of 3D effect and how easy or pleasant it is to view. And you have two primary tools to control baseline: the lens separation when you take the photo, and the amount of subject depth you have in your composition, and the way that depth is distributed. And plus, I hope you were able to see how the experience of viewing a 3D photograph depends on how you're viewing it. If you were able to do the business where you got up and walked back from the photo and saw how it changed. So I know I've thrown maybe a lot at you. Don't get overwhelmed. Just become aware of what you're doing, in particular, the depth in your scene and the baseline you're using when you photograph it. Could you move slightly, or point the camera, or frame differently to include or exclude something close in your composition, like an overhanging tree branch? And a big one, one of the biggest ones, and one of the things I see the most trouble with on Instagram posts is what's directly behind your main subject. Is it something far away that has a lot of visual contrast with your main subject? Or is it something that won't compete visually in terms of depth, or in terms, like I say, contrast with your main subject? And that's why I really showed you a lot of pictures where I had things that were uncomfortably superimposed, because I see a lot of that. And if you want to see, a lot of people are posting flower photos. That seems to be a common thing to start off with, or even keep up with when you're shooting 3D. Get on the Instagram and look at Sangeeta's posts, her flower pictures. She really controls the depth very effectively. She'll either isolate the subject by having it against blank sky, or using a bokeh effect to blur out the background so it is not as visually competitive with the foreground, or she'll crop in very closely so you don't see anything other than the flower itself. There's no background, and then she can amp up the depth. But her images are worth studying. She consistently delivers flower close-ups against all sorts of different backgrounds that are easy to view, and of course they're great photos too. So that's it. That ends the scheduled portion of our broadcast. Let me minimize this and open it up to questions, assuming we've got time. Didn't see how long I was running there.
No, we've got about 7 or 8 minutes for questions.
Okay, perfect.
So we've got,
David, you should exit. Stop sharing.
Well, I didn't know if I was going to have to show.
We might go back to some examples. Never mind.
Yeah.
So I see lots of comments, and I did want to stop though and ask Sangeeta to drop your Instagram handle in the chat in case people aren't already following you, Sangeeta. And yes, so any questions for David?
Yeah, I've got one.
I'll say one thing. One thing David didn't mention, which we all probably know, but when you're taking multiple pictures with a single camera, like in his example, obviously if there's subject material that is moving between the images, that's going to cause a lot of problems. If it's minor things, and it's a subject that David could do very well in another workshop, I've done multiples like that. And if it's just one subject, like a person was standing there and they happen to have moved a little bit, Stereo Photo Maker has a feature called the Stereo Clone tool, and one could either clone the one or the other of the moved image into the other so that it becomes like integrated, I should say. So it solves that problem. Or in some cases, somebody's in one shot and not in the other shot at all, and you can remove them completely in an invisible way using the Stereo Clone tool.
Yeah, the clone tool's incredibly useful and worth its weight in gold. But it is not entirely intuitive, but David Starkman just happens to have written an excellent tutorial on how to use it. It's on the homepage of Masuji's site, where you download Stereo Photo Maker to begin with, because it's not on a menu. You have to know that to start using it, what is it? You hold down the Shift key, and then suddenly the cursor changes to the clone tool, and then the settings for how you're going to use it, the brush size and all that, are on a menu somewhere. But it's not at all obvious how you start using it because there is no menu. Anyway, David's tutorial on it is excellent. It's actually easy to use once you know how, but there are a few tricks to it.
The tutorial is literally just one page, and I wrote it for myself because the steps, even now when I use it, sometimes I will just refer back to it to remind myself how to use it.
And I don't want to get off the subject too much, and maybe Pascal will even cover this, but one thing that I learned from Susan Pinsky, David Starkman's better half, is that if you are shooting a moving subject, especially clouds, you're shooting a big hyper stereo and the clouds are moving, you move your camera in the direction that the clouds are moving. So if the clouds are moving left to right, you take your exposures left to right, and vice versa. And that will save a lot of grief in cloning and various other things when you're taking outdoor hyper stereos.
So someone has dropped the link to the tutorial in the chat if you guys need to pick that up. Somebody had a question right before David.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I did really quickly. When you were mentioning bokeh and background as another element to consider, I was just curious if there's any kind of rule of thumb or I don't even know if ideas about aperture and as far as like creating depth using lenses, if there's any way to like not any way, but if there's a rule of thumb as far as choosing your depth of field within the lenses, as well as your distance between lenses.
Well, you brought up a very interesting topic, because I would say up until a couple of years ago, it was absolutely kind of stereoscopic gospel that you never used selective focus in 3D, that you just exactly the opposite of 2D, because you have the depth effect. You never use selective focus to isolate your subject. You do that purely compositionally. But again, all you have to do is look through Sangeeta's stuff to see that it works just fine when you do it right. So it's funny because that has really changed. I don't, I guess, have a rule of thumb other than I think when you look at 3Ds, you will find the reason we had that rule for so many years is a lot of times it can be visually disturbing for something to be out of focus or to use depth of field, because that's not how your eye scans a 3D photograph, much like it scans the real world. It goes through parts of the scene, and in the real world, your eye refocuses when it goes to the background. So it's always, you may be looking at something that's close, but as soon as you shift your gaze to the distance, you refocus and it becomes sharp. So you don't have that experience of limited depth of field in your visual system. And to the extent that 3D was attempting to reproduce your visual system, like I say, it was always considered you don't do that. But there's no question, if you do it right, it works. And Sangeeta is probably a better person than me to talk about how to do it, because I virtually never do. But I think one of the nice things is, I'm guessing, yeah, Sangeeta, you can pop in if you want. I'm guessing she's doing it all in software. In other words, she's shooting stuff that's all sharp and then applying it afterwards, which allows her to do it empirically. In other words, okay, she does it until it works, and then she stops doing it when it doesn't work. And the thing is that at least for me, I'm not shooting with a DSLR. I'm shooting with my phone or a variety of different 3D cameras, all of which are either APS-C or smaller sensors. And in all of those cameras, it is virtually impossible to get a picture where everything isn't in focus. They all have complete depth of field. So it used to be, if you're shooting on a 35 millimeter camera with a telephoto lens, it was easy to throw things out of focus. You opened up to f4.5 and we're lucky if you had anything in focus. But now it seems like it's impossible to apply depth of focus when I'm shooting stuff. None of my cameras really have the mechanics to allow that. So like I say, I think you're probably actually better off shooting stuff all in focus and then trying to do it in post. But again, I don't have any rules other than I think you will find rapidly, if you start experimenting around with it, what works and what doesn't. And again, I don't want to bog you down with a lot of rules, because the thing is when you're out there in the real world, there's just too many variables, and there's too many variables in terms of how it's ultimately going to be used. Are you going to make an image that is only going to be shown on a certain size phone screen, and you're never going to allow someone to ever see it anyplace else? You're going to control that. Usually these things get out in the wild and you don't have control, so you just do the best you can and hope after that it'll look okay.
Hey, I want to get one more question in here from Cindy. I'll just read her question from the chat. I'm wondering about calculating baseline when using twin cameras, and the distance between them can be changed. I understand there are baseline calculating apps. Is there a good one for Android phones?
I've used them in the past, but again, it's what I said. Usually when you're out there in the wild, first of all, you don't know the distance unless you're running around with a tape measure or a rangefinder or something like that. And again, you don't know, do you know how that image is going to be used? So there are definitely baseline calculators. I haven't used one in so long, I don't remember which one it is. I think Masuji wrote it actually. And it's this exactly what I was talking about. You give it the closest and farthest thing. I can't remember if you tell it the deviation or it gives you the deviation. It's been a while, but all I can say is, as a practicing stereographer, I've just never found it worth the trouble. Number one, after you've shot for a while, you'll get an intuition. And the other thing, I usually just shoot a variety of them. And then when I get home, when I look at them, I pick out the one that worked best. It's easier to do that than to spend 10 minutes calculating the damn thing and then find out you got it wrong anyway, you know? So I tend to go very empirical on that. Try a bunch of, things. And all I can say is, again, if you're anything like me, you'll always use too much. The smallest one you used will still be too big.
Well, thank you so much, David. That was really, really clear and thorough. Enough for someone like me to understand.
Yeah, I tried not to overwhelm you. Like I say, Pascal really tasked me to do something that was digestible. And like I say, I don't know if I achieved. He told me I achieved that. Whether or not he was just being kind or I did it, that's up to you.
He may have been being kind, but you did actually.
It was both.
Achieve it. Yes. And the examples I felt were really helpful.